Welcome back to the Renaissance Space podcast, where we take some time to listen and glean a better understanding of life and education. My name is Margaret Allen, and I'm delighted to be speaking to Dr Helen Ross, who in her recently published book, Literacy Learning Journeys, talks about the different ways in which we can open a book. Reading, as we all know, can stimulate a whole range of emotions, and together with my colleague, Emma Dibden, who is our education specialist for Wellbeing and SEND, we hope to explore these with Helen. Welcome, Helen. Thank you for being part of this podcast today, and Emma for joining us. So, Emma, I'm going to ask you I think you've actually read the book, haven't you?
Indeed, it's very well thumbed and full of post-it notes. Veritable rainbow.
I'm looking at the little sticky thing over the video. I can see it's
isn't it? Yeah, it's part of my process. And it's such a lovely thing to be able to read Helen's book. I think we probably crossed paths first a couple of years ago, Helen, when our lovely friend Gareth Morwood put us in touch with each other. And since then, I think I've been really blessed to I hope, call Helen a friend of Renaissance. Helen joined us with a previous SEND Searchlights episode where we started to dig into some of the questions that were coming from colleagues who are out there supporting young people about dyslexia. So to have Helen's book in my hand and have it be well thumbed already, and I've shared some insights with my colleagues, it was really exciting. And I don't want to undersell Helen, but I know you touch so many different people and so many different lives, but predominantly Dr Helen Ross is a specialist assessor, and perhaps maybe first and foremost is a bit like me, passionate about really helping children and young people and their families to understand their strengths and challenges and to access education as a consequence. So I would, if you don't mind, Helen, like to take you to a quote in the book that really stood out to me as a place to just start our conversation.
Oh Lordy, I don't remember what I wrote.
Oh well, listen, I'll prompt you with a memory just to help you along, and it's around one of your reflection points about reading comprehension and the love of reading. And I found that particularly fascinating because my own husband, who is autistic and has dyslexia, he has more recently found himself engaging in audiobooks. So all of the old classics he's listening to, including Count of Monte Cristo, I think it is. Is that one? Does that sound about right? Anyway, my point was, as a child, he hated reading. He really did. And now he's really connected with a love of words, but also through audiobook. And one of the things that you wrote about within your reflection point, and I will read to jog your memory, from a UK DFE perspective, so any of our colleagues who might be overseas, that's the Department of Education in England, you say, reading comprehension expectations state that young people should be taught to develop pleasure in reading as the first step for reading comprehension. And this is expected to develop motivation and engagement with reading. However, can we teach children to love something or just how to do it? And that was really interesting for me because I was going, oh, okay, so is reading for pleasure really that panacea? Is it? And if you experience barriers, can you ever really love reading? And I guess we're talking about reading in the traditional sense. I just wondered if you wouldn't mind building that out a little bit and giving a bit more context around that.
Do you know what? This is a bugbear of mine. That's the polite version of what I say. So I read a lot. I read an awful lot. I hate reading. I can't stand it. It's a tool. It's a tool to get stuff in. Whether it's stories, whether it's generally literature, academic literature at the moment, because of what I'm doing with some work, whether it's who won the football, whatever, it's a tool. And for some people, they'll love that tool. For some people, they'll get a story and vacuum it. My brother vacuums up books. He really enjoys reading. But for me, I'm why would I read the book when I can watch the film? That's my thought process. And I find it so disingenuous until you are teaching people they must love algebra, because algebra is a tool. If you use Excel, you use algebra every day. If you are adding up the price of two different types of products in a shop, that is algebra, because knives have a cost and spoons have a cost. That's algebra. Why are we not teaching children they must love maths? They must love algebra. They're both tools to access information, a certain way of thinking. So it really, really irks me. And I found it, the last school I worked at was gorgeous. I will extol Stonehenge School. I loved working there. The head Carol is She's gorgeous. I love her. She's a really wonderful woman. And Nigel at the time, deliberately dropping names because they're brilliant. And one of the things that I thought was an interesting thing within that school, but that was my experience. Equally, it happens in loads of other schools, was we were told, we were kind of promoting reading and all the rest of it. We were told, like, tell the kids what books you're reading, share your love of reading. I'm like, I'm not going to lie to my kids. My kids know I'm dyslexic. They know if I tell them I love reading, they'll know I'm lying. So I told my kids what book I was reading. And at the time, I was reading something by Bourdieu, so like a French philosopher in French. So they're like, Dr Ross, what are you reading? I'm like, well, here's what I'm reading. What? Why are you reading that? I was like, it's for work. Or I was reading like various points. That was a book by Stephen McDonald around dyslexia, just bits of stuff around work. And they're like, do you like it? I'm like, well, not particularly, but I need to. And for me, it was really difficult to navigate that because, like, I'm dyslexic. For me, the notion of dyslexia is a superpower in the context of reading. That's nonsensical for me. I speak for myself, nobody else in this context. Luckily, like Carol and them at the school, they were proper sound. But I think the pressure it puts on children to love something that might be just like platin fog, it's an unnecessary pressure that they have to love it. You've got to be able to do reading, ideally. If not, you've got to be able to get the information in there, whether that's via an audio book, your computer talking at you, listening to somebody else say it, like whatevs. You've got to be able to engage with information, for me.
But I think that's really nicely put. In fact, I spoke to, in the recent podcast, we had Jeffrey Boachi on, and he was talking about how reading is not about the words on the page. It's about the escapism and the moments to reflect and the provoking of linking with experiences. And we also recently spoke to the dyscalculia folk, and that was fascinating. Just lovely to listen to them talking in a similar way to you, but about numbers. But essentially, how do we engage those children? How do we pull them into the space if our objectives as teachers, as schools, as people who are providing that environment, how do we offer that diet that's palatable?
Sally Ann Morrison had the most beautiful turn of phrase. It was like, it's not a superpower, it's like a way of being. And I think dyslexia is a way of being. I wish I could remember the wording, but I think that was what she wrote. And I thought it was so beautifully put. And for some like ways of being, and in French you say façon d'être, so it makes sense, like way of being. Like not everything chimes with everybody in there.
No, absolutely. And I think as a former primary school teacher, if someone was asked me to track reading, I would think about decoding, I would think about comprehension and those sort of stepping stones that makes you a reader, because the education system is demanding that of me as a teacher. I know, Emma, something very dear to your heart is that balance between outcome and time to be managed in terms of, as a teacher, how do we make that stack? How do we help children to transition from pointing at words to being excited about holding a book or listening to a story or hearing someone read it to you?
Yeah, I think as well, Helen, that was something within the book, because you took the approach of kind of describing the sort of literacy learning journey across developmental stages of education. And you kind of get to that point, don't you, where you've got these really kind of enthusiastic little people who are soaking up the world of language, and vocabulary is extending, and they're starting to interact in more sophisticated ways socially. And, maybe you could unpick a little bit more about that, because there's a point, isn't there, particularly within the English education system, and I acknowledge that we'll have people who are working outside of that, but maybe kind of look back to similar factors, where there is that kind of expectation for formality, where word, both written and read word, take over from language. But of course, we understand that if you haven't got that kind of bedrock, all of the other stuff that follows, whether that's because developmentally you've got some gaps in language, or whether that's because you're a second language speaker whose acquisition perhaps for your language of instruction is not quite where everybody else is, that can help, or those can be sort of influential factors, I guess, if you're thinking about dyslexia specifically, because, we're all on different pathways, aren't we?
Yeah, it's so huge. There's a whole lot to unpack from the question. So my little dude, he's already coming up for 6 in May. His writing, I don't have the magical skill set of primary school teachers to be able to read all of his writing. He works his little socks off, bless him. But he's a criminal mastermind. His verbal skills, man, he could get world peace. Put him in a room with Trump. Trump would come with cap in hand. Because Daniel is relentless. But I think I see in him a real thirst for learning, and he remembers everything he's doing is about Kingdom Brunel. We live near Bristol, so we're going to go over. And he remembers all of that. And then if you ask him to write it down, he's okay at the moment. But then give it 2 or 3 years. So what, he's year 1 now. So when he gets to year 2 or 3, the ramping up of right expectations and just the emphasis on the written word. And what I don't want for him, and what I see with the kids that come to me by the time they get to being assessed, the kids are broken. And I don't mean that in the like they're broken, we've got to fix them. It's they're so broken by a system that is bombarding them, especially like the transition between year 2 and 3 just seems to wallop children where it hurts, because it just gets so much more formal. So like between 7 and 8 years old-ish, the kids, they know, they compare themselves to each other. So they might know they're really good at the spoken word. They also know they can't spell. And they also know they can't write neatly because it's so obvious. We've just written up a paper with my colleagues from John Moores Uni at Liverpool. We've done a project. And one of the real kind of stabby, like really sad things was the kids were so self-conscious about their spellings. And it was one of the things, and the school I worked in was gorgeous. And if they're listening, they'll know who they are. I'd send my little boy there, but it's in a different town. And so I think with the written word, it's so obvious because it's there for posterity. So that's why it's really difficult. Whereas at least if you say it and we're not recording it, it can kind of disappear into the ether.
And children are critical too, aren't they? You know, they're very self-critical. And then that's when confidence and well-being and all of that scrutiny actually gets so crystallized that they fail before they've even started.
Yeah, so what Margaret just said really resonated as well in terms of that kind of impact to well-being, and that is definitely a thread through the book as well. And I think certainly as somebody who used to be in similarly primary education setting to Margaret, you know, we were using tools that helped us to track kind of learners' perceptions of self. And what we were finding particularly as they moved from Key Stage 1 into Key Stage 2, we were seeing those learners who had profiles of need start to slip in terms of their perception of self and their kind of their sense of how they were getting on as a learner. And I think that was because they became increasingly aware of what others could do that they perceived that they couldn't do. And that does come down to that kind of formality of expectation and outcome. And I know that like my own son was blessed to start working on a laptop when he was in year 5 because he experienced some of the barriers you're talking about, your little person, like handwriting, you know, it's trying to read a doctor's scrawl, isn't it? But that was life-changing. I mean, that was positively life-changing for him. And I think, you know, some of the practical strategies that you talk about in the book, you know, I know that's one of the things that whenever we talk to colleagues in schools, they want to soak up kind of all that practical stuff. But one of the things you said was that time's the most important thing for anybody and everybody, but maybe that's something we could dig into, because I know that teachers who are pressed against a dense curriculum and expected to kind of achieve all these outcomes, how do we wrestle with the kind of friction between that and giving the learners the time they need just to take a beat, to process and to thrive in that time?
How long is a piece of string? Twice says my husband.
Yeah.
It's a really difficult question. It's quite interesting actually, because a lot of schools by us, say Wiltshire, a lot of schools are doing like mixed year groups. And I don't know, for some schools it will be a fiscal decision because there's just not bums on seats. But for other schools, it feels like it's not, like it doesn't have to be a fiscal decision. And I'm trying to make sense of it. And one of the things that came out of some me just kind of going, what's going on? Wait, talk to me. Like, not in a judgy way. I just genuinely don't get it. And apparently one of the thought processes behind it is building in time. And they explained it as, if you're in like D's in a year 1-2 class, so he gets stuff once in year 1, and then he gets stuff again, but slightly differently in year 2. So they're sort of building time in that way through some creative pedagogy. His teacher is spectacular. I don't even know. She's primary school teachers is a dark art I don't understand. But she has those kids eating out the palm of her hand because she is brilliant. And they were doing Titanic and Deacon. He verbatim, it feels like he's like narrating YouTube about the Titanic. But he will then get that again in a different way next year. The same flavour of, you know, the same objectives will be covered. What they are, I don't know, because I don't know the detail off by heart. I always have to check back on the framework. It's fascinating.
That practical application that you see in action in a well rehearsed, well planned curriculum. I can remember we used to partner the weak year 6 children with the stronger year 2, and they didn't know what was going on. They just thought that they were having a nice time with someone in a different part of the school. But the impact on the reward for the year 6 who thought they were top dog, not really understanding that they were dealing with a child who probably could read better than them, it was amazing. And it just took somebody to think through those sorts of scenarios rather than pigeonhole, well, in year 2 we do this, and in year 3 we do this, and in year 4 we do that, and then at the end we'll have children who will all sit their sats and it'll all be marvellous. Well, life isn't like that, is it?
No, and I think that is that creative out of the box thinking that primary school teachers just have in a way that I just don't as a secondary school teacher. And I think it's because you're a lot more siloed, aren't you? Like, I trained in MFL, so I can do French and Spanish if you really want me to. But I got most creative when I ended up teaching maths and French because I did engineering and French at uni. And then you had to think a bit cross-curricularly because you're in foot in 2 camps. But primary school teachers just do that because it's the dark art that you master.
And I do wonder then, like when learners go on to secondary, there are going to be some that kind of thrive at that point of transition because they prefer perhaps the more structured approach. And, you know, if they don't get on with Mr. Brown, but they get on really well with Mrs. Smith kind of thing, I've only got to put up with Mr. Brown for an hour, you know, and then I can go into Mrs. Smith's lesson for whatever purpose. But those where they make kind of connections between learning because of that kind of cross-curricular nature. I do often wonder, you know, when we kind of see these young people flourish and move on to secondary out of primary, how will they navigate that change? How will they manage that change? And how will their secondary teachers support them? Because that's a very different type and style of pedagogy for all the right reasons, because you're helping them to move through that kind of formality of education and building life skills. But I always think that one's an interesting one.
I think loads of schools are doing it really differently. So, like in England, there's some schools, like there's a couple over in Bradford. They do like one session or 2 every 2 weeks. They're on the 2-week timetable. That's kind of application of humanities type mixed type learning. That's the best I can use, but it's basically a mixed curriculum session. Other schools do. When I was at Stonehenge, my role was to sort of work with a nurture group type thing, and they do it. There's a couple of schools in Trowbridge do it. There's schools in Bath do it, where some of the kids, not all of them, but it varies. Some schools do all of it, some schools do both, where I had kids for maths, science and English, and they were the kids that really just needed that like littler class, consistency of teacher in that primary school flavour in year 7 and 8, so that they could kind of ease their way into secondary school. And I think that's a really good way to do it because they're in secondary school, so they're getting the whole like pecking order thing. But the nurture, the support within being like a little cocoon is also really important. Or like the curriculum for Wales is really interesting with this one because it just runs through. A year ago, I was doing a lot more work with it, but the curriculum for Wales is sort of not fixed. There's 4 broad subject areas or broad skills areas, I think it is. And within those skills areas, then you have to, the school can fit what it wants. You know, so they might group maths and art together because of geometry, for example. They might group music and physics together because of the maths of music. So there's a lot more freedom in that respect. And it's really interesting to kind of have, I was involved in developing a program of kind of STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts and mathematics. And I wasn't in charge of it, but I was involved with sort of the initial stages of this amazing program that hit humanities computer program. It was such a clever program called UNCO2. And that really did all of that cross-curriculum stuff. And it was aimed sort of broadly key stage 3. But yeah, there's stuff can be done, but it would need, I think it's a two-pronged approach addressing that, because you need training on the spot for teachers doing it now, but also then you'd need training for people coming through. And it's such a fundamental system change. Would it happen? Probably not.
So if we switch slightly and think about home life and families and the supports and the pressure that the parents are feeling vicariously for their children and the comparisons that people inevitably do make, they try not to, but of course, what other benchmark do they have? How do we accommodate that additional pressure that those children are feeling or not getting by way of support?
I think that's where having clear pathways, particularly for secondary school, like little kids, they're like, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a footballer. And not that that's a bad thing, like aim for the stars and all the rest of it, literally or not. There is an element of you can't see it, you can't be it. So for around dyslexia or whatever specific learning difficulty, these people like Jamie Oliver or like Maggie Adder-Pocock, who is, I'm in awe of her, who do loads of really good work with the platforms they've got. It's useful to look at them as like role models, and actually quite good for those two in particular, because Jamie Oliver didn't do uni. He wasn't bothered. That wasn't his pathway. Whereas Maggie Adder-Pocock, well, she's pre-academic. And I think having pathways where kids can see different ways forwards is helpful. Because one of my kids, she's not going to go to uni, but she's canny. Does that mean we don't care about her? And I feel like there's not the same clarity of different ways forward. And I think we are doing our kids a disservice by not promoting, if you want to be a plumber, be a damn good plumber. Or like do whatever you want to do. One of my kids wants to be a jeweler, and she will do it because her parents are epic. You don't have to do uni to be a jeweler. My friend from home did, but yeah, it is so.
It's celebrating success in all its forms, isn't it? I know Tom Rees and Ben Newmark, who, colleagues who are in the UK might know those names. Definitely worth a Google if you don't. They talk about the kind of the challenges of a meritocracy, but understanding that, success, like you say, doesn't necessarily mean a pathway through academia. That works for some people, but in other instances, those vocations and people thrive, and it really resonates when you kind of talk about, the opportunity to have role models and to look at those people who are using their platform. But I think even beyond that, sometimes those people feel out of touch. Just being aspirational for our learners and kind of feeding that energy that anything is possible. If that's what you want to do, go and do it to the best of your ability. And I know, just coming back to the book, I am going to do a shameless plug, because for anybody who might be new to kind of discovering what it means to be on an education journey as somebody with dyslexia, I found the approach that Helen's taken of kind of interweaving references to research that are well-founded, but alongside those kind of lived experience of practitioners in settings and Helen's own lived experience. And also, we were talking about it before we started, with the brilliant kind of illustrations that just help to bring to life some of those points. And it is absolutely deep with practical strategies. So, for anybody who's not certain about the best ways to support those young people kind of on their journey, all the way from kind of early years through into the world beyond a formal education, whatever path that might be, whatever trajectory, I think Helen does a cracking job. So I would definitely recommend kind of having a look, whether it will be as well thumbed as mine. That's just my way of working. We talk about strategies, mine's plastered with post-it notes, each annotated and so on and so forth. But yeah, definitely. And Helen, thank you so much. I mean, we valued from your thoughts at the Send Searchlights, and we take equal value from your thoughts today. And it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
What a brilliant way to finish. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as me, hearing Helen articulate how even if it feels gently chaotic or you need to take a second run at it, we can all paint our own picture, which gives us the access we need. And whether it's to become an engineer or just being content to access the world of reading in whatever guise we find works. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Renaissance Space podcast, please take a moment to rate and review us. And don't forget that you can catch up on all previous episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search for the Renaissance Space podcast. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of the Renaissance Space podcast, please check out the Education Joining the Dots podcast from our colleagues at GL Assessment. Thank you.